Awesome. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. So, Svi, thank you so much for joining us today. For folks who joined, my name is Divya Smith. I'm CEO of Ascending Avenue Investments. We have just about over $200 million in assets at this point in time. We are excited to continue to bring investment opportunities to our investors. And today, we also like to bring knowledge and things that we can share so that you can continue to move along in your investment journey and your knowledge as you think about your future and your financial health. So today we have Svi with us. He has been instrumental for my LinkedIn journey in knowledge as I continue to learn from him about 1031 exchanges and also the LLC setup that he talks about. So today we will be focusing on 1031 exchanges. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Svi just to introduce himself, and then we'll jump right in and start understanding and asking questions about what 1031 exchanges are.
Thank you, Divya. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. Always happy to share knowledge and help other people out. My real estate experience is actually not that long. I was a lawyer back in the day, around the turn of the century. I saw what was going on in high tech. That was very exciting for me. So I dropped out of law and went into high tech for a while. Was an entrepreneur, ran a software company, did a lot of marketing, and then just like fast forward through the whole journey to 2020, in the middle of COVID, and I got into real estate. So my first dive into real estate was actually 1031. I worked for a 1031 company, and it was the heyday of real estate, as you know. So we were processing about 35 exchanges a day, which was like no simple feat.
Right.
And yeah, and my career has continued from there, and here I am today.
Understood. Understood. Well, thank you so much. Well, thanks for being here. So it sounds like if the first time you did, 35, 40 almost, 1031 exchanges, that sounds like that helps you jump right in and then kind of even start learning quickly. And now you've been doing this for many years. So, which is fantastic to kind of hear for all of us. And you can probably simplify this, mystified topic that is 1031. So we'll start really basic. What is a 1031 exchange?
So at the core of 1031 and the core of all the problems of 1031 is the fact that the government about 100 years ago decided that if people exchange property, they don't actually sell it to somebody else, they just swap properties. They're not going to tax that because there's no money passed, and therefore you can't tax somebody on something he hasn't sold. But as everything else, the smart lawyers and the smart businessmen have turned that into something much bigger than just swapping property. And every sale today can be turned into, not every sale, many sales can be turned into a 1031 exchange. So as people push the envelope, they had to figure out where to cut it off and say, no, this is not an exchange, this is a sale. And these are the rules you have to follow to call it an exchange rather than a sale. And that's where all the problems start.
Got it. Got it. Thank you. I'm just taking notes here, and we'll have to come back to some of these things. All right, understood. So 1031 exchange is a way to be able to exchange properties and exchange other business related things. We'll talk about it. Could be investment, could be personal and work, investment related. So we will talk about that. Now, when would I need to think about a 1031 exchange?
So believe it or not, every time they'd give me an order to process an exchange, they would say it's really quick. We need it done within the hour. And I'm like, come on, everything can't be a rush. Until I was actually at headquarters and I was sitting waiting to speak to the CEO, and I was going through the pamphlets in the lobby, and it said, we process 1031 exchanges in 1 hour. So I realized, oh, I got it. A lot of these people would never thought about 1031 exchange until they got to the closing table. Now, that's not a great idea, but it can be done. If things are sort of aligned in your favor, but generally you should be thinking about it depending on how complex your ownership structure is. Probably a month or two before is best to start thinking about it.
So Svi, you talked about, being at the closing table. Why would someone want to think about a 1031 exchange? What are the benefits? Why would I even consider a 1031 exchange?
Because somebody just whispered in his ear and said to him, this is a great deal, but you know you're going to owe $500,000 in taxes in about an hour from now, and I got a way for you to avoid it. And funnily enough, that's actually a real scenario that happens.
Wow. Wow. So there are folks there that are actually at the closing table not realizing the amount of money in taxes that they're going to owe from a sale of an investment property or their personal home. That's fantastic. Like that's just crazy to hear.
They may know that they'll be due for the taxes, but they don't know that there's a way to get out of it.
Got it. Okay. Okay. So, let's talk about that. So, There are benefits that 1031 exchanges offers. So kind of just thinking through, I know there's some tax benefits, but then there's some other benefits as well. So let's start breaking it down. So what are the tax benefits of 1031 exchanges?
It really comes down to tax benefits. I don't know what other benefits there could be, but everybody's head, especially 1031 people, it's all about the taxes. It's all about the money, about the taxes. What happens is that you have a capital gains tax from your sale of a property and you don't want to pay it. More than that, not only is there capital gains tax, but any depreciation you took. So like, you have $1 million property and I don't want to get into low level, but there's also, let's say, depreciation. So that's even a higher level, a higher rate of taxes than capital gains. And then there's bonus depreciation, which is taxed at ordinary income rates. So that's even a higher level. And that's going to be I guess you can call it your tax stack once the sale is consummated. And you don't want to pay those.
Understood. Understood. Okay, so let's say to your example, we had $1 million property, and let's say I was going to make a capital gains, and we'll keep it simple for now, like we'll leave depreciation aside. And let's say the capital gains were 500,000. Now, if I did a 1031 exchange into, say, at the sale of the property, you end up creating it, but it then also has another second step to it. Now you need to go buy a 1031 property. So
Exactly.
okay, so now let's say you had originally paid $1 million for a property, you made gains, and it is 1.5 mil now. You take that 1.5 mil, you put it in a 1031 exchange, and then what do you do after that?
Nothing. You're done. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of steps along the way and it's complicated, but that's the idea. You need to take all the money and buy another property with it, which means I didn't make any money from the sale. I'm not using any money. No money went to my pocket, and therefore it's not taxable, which is the idea, the concept of the 1031 exchange from its inception. People often make a mistake. They think all they have to put into the next deal is just the capital gains taxes, which in your example will be $500,000. And that's a big mistake.
Got it. Okay. But let's say they put it in 1031 exchange, they would still need to go out and buy a property with that 1.5 million, and it requires certain rules.
Right. I mean, that's the idea, that they took the money and they bought a property with it. And we call it the two sides of an exchange, either the replacement property, which is the property that you bought, and the relinquished property, which is the property you sold. So you sell the relinquished property and you buy a replacement property. And it's as if you just swapped the relinquished property for the replacement property and you don't pay any taxes.
Understood. At what point in time, let's say a person who is kind of jumping into 1031 for the first time would need to think about this exchange? Is it prior to selling the relinquished property? Like at what point in time?
Yes, because one of the rules of 1031 exchange is that no money can hit your account. Assuming that the money goes into his lawyer's escrow at the closing table, and then somebody says, how about a 1031 exchange? He says, well, it's a great idea. Okay. And then they call us up. It's too late. As soon as the money hit his account or his escrow, then the taxes are due, and there's nothing he can do to reverse that anymore. So it's got to be done before any money hits his account.
Understood. Okay. Wow. Okay. So that is a little detail that I think a lot of folks that I even talked to today don't understand. So the 1031 exchange needs to be set up prior to the sale of the relinquished or the old property before jumping to the new property.
Right. There's a rule called constructive receipt. It's not only if the money came to his hands, but there's all kinds of ways to receive money from a sale that would also mean that he can't do an exchange anymore. Like people think, okay, I put in a lawyer's escrow. No, that doesn't help. Or if you get a check for it, no, that doesn't help. Or if you give it to a friend who you have access to the money or anything like that, there are a lot of strict rules of what's called constructive receipt. So the main
Understood.
thing, first of all, you should never get his hands on it. And then there's rules you have to follow while the money is sitting idle before you purchased a replacement property. That would be no-nos and would mean that you're liable on the taxes.
Understood. Svi, so just, I know a few folks just joined, so we're going to summarize this because my goodness, like this is just such an important piece of nugget. So if you are thinking about a 1031 exchange, that needs to be set up and thought about prior to the actual sale of the property. Because as soon as that money from the sale hits your account, you are no longer eligible for 1031 exchange. How long do you usually recommend people to kind of think about this? Of course, like more time the better, but at a minimum, let's say they are going to, I know you said 1 hour for your prior company, but let's say they're going for a sale closing this Friday and they think about, hey, we need to do a 1031 exchange. If they start having a conversation and really putting it in place, can they do it like say Monday of that week? Or do they probably want prior to that?
Right. So, like I said, you can do it 1 minute before the closing, but there's a lot of problems with doing that. You want to do it like a month before you want to think about it because there's a lot of things that the exchanger needs to understand. Number one, he needs to get used to certain concepts, which take a while for it to sink in. And when there's a complicated ownership structure, that really complicates the exchange. And then you would have to get everybody on board for that. We just had somebody who called up for an exchange, and he had a bunch of partners, and I told my guy, let's do exchange for these guys. This is a no-brainer. He said, no, it's not going to work with these guys because to get everybody on board, we're not going to be able to do it. The time frame is too short, and they don't understand. And there's certain things. There are a lot of things that you have to do for an exchange that make people very queasy, okay? And therefore, they got to sort of be educated before they're ready to do an exchange.
Understood, understood. Okay, so let's take a simpler example. Let's say it's a husband and wife, they had bought a property. I'm taking my own example here.
Mhm.
I had a townhome that I sold early on, and then if I wanted to do a 1031 exchange for it, how should I go about like ideal client? I'm not last minute. If I was to kind of follow along, like what would be the ideal step one, two, three for me?
Just to give you an idea, the process of doing an exchange means you have to sign two documents. And the money doesn't go to you, the money goes to us. One document is an exchange agreement, which explains what the exchange is all about, and you have to make us your qualified intermediary, and we can talk about that more if you'd like. And the second one is the assignment. You have to assign the property to the qualified intermediary, because the idea is if you're buying from one person and selling to another person, you didn't exchange. But if you put somebody in the middle, you put a qualified intermediary, and you give him the property. So you're giving the qualified intermediary property. He's going out and buying you a property and giving it to you. So you are doing an exchange with him. You're giving him one property and they're giving you back another property. Then it becomes a real exchange. So those are the two things: to have an exchange agreement and to assign it to the qualified intermediary. It scares people to see on top of the closing statement that the seller is the qualified intermediary on behalf of you, and you've basically given up your property. But again, if you understand exchanges, you haven't really given up anything legally, and there's no real risk exposure over there.
Understood. So if let's say I was going out and selling my property, I'm sorry. So let's say I'm going to go out and sell my property, and it would be ideal for me to have identified a qualified intermediary ahead of time, potentially understood the process with them, and then bringing them to the closing table. Now, this is where you said the money goes into your bank account. So I do not need to set up that account. It goes into yours, and now you're managing that separately. And
Correct.
from my understanding, Svi, that is a brand new entity that is getting created because that is where the property is held at that point in time. Is that accurate?
Um, Not really, because what's going to happen is we do not take title to the property. And that's, again, these are the nuances of exchanges. You can deed the property directly from you to the buyer.
Okay.
We don't have to get involved. The money comes to us, and it's as if we sell the property, but we're not actually taking title to the property.
So I have a quick question. I think it's related, so I'll just quickly take it. So what happens if you miss the deadline to identify or miss the closing deadline? And I think Svi had just shared that a few minutes ago. If you do miss it and you get that money in your bank account, it's too late. So the rules dictate clearly that money cannot hit your bank account, or you said your friends, or in any shape or form, you could have an easy access to it. I think the bottom line is you do not have access to those funds. And that is the way to make sure that you have a clean, clear 1031 exchange set up correctly.
Correct.
I think
There are a
that,
few deadlines for 1031 exchange, and they're brutal. I mean, they are merciless. If you miss it by 1 minute, you're out. And that's just part of the quirkiness of 1031 exchange. And, missing the closing or having the money for 1 second is one of them. And you touched on the identification period, which again, probably may be of interest. And, we can go into that as well.
yeah. So thank you. So I think just taking it step by step, that's been really helpful. All right. So if you're going to go out and sell the property, first, make sure you identify an intermediary if you can. Then at that point in time, you bring them to the closing table. They're able to help you kind of close that property. sell that property, the funds that are then held with, say, use fee for as an intermediary, how much time do folks have before they need to buy the second property?
So there's two deadlines. The first deadline is they have to ID the property, which means, theoretically, if you're swapping property, you know which property you're acquiring. But there's something called, they developed another exchange called the delayed exchange, where I could give it to person today and only get the property later. But that doesn't go on indefinitely. You have 45 days to identify the property that you're going to be purchasing in exchange for the property that you sold. And identification is actually one of the more complicated aspects of 1031 exchange. There's all kinds of ways that you can identify. So you can identify 3 properties. Okay, that's called the 3 property rule. Any 3 properties, and you could buy, it doesn't make a difference what their value is. You could buy any of the 3. Okay, then there's the 200% rule, which means you could identify as many properties as you want, but it can't be more than 200. The total value can't be more than 200% of the value of the property that you sold. And then there's a catch-all rule that says we don't care how many properties or how much money, as long as at the end of the day you acquire 95% of whatever you identified. And that's hardly ever used because that's not realistic. So it's generally the 3 property rule, because you want to know what you're buying and you usually have a handle on it. I mean, because the deadline is so tight, there's another deadline which is called the 180-day deadline. You need to close on the purchase within 180 days. So we're not talking about very long time frames over here. You need to hit the ground, and this is like really crucial. You need to hit the ground running when you do a 1031 exchange. It's very nice to do one at the closing table, but if you're only thinking about it now and you have no idea what you're buying, now often they know what they're buying without a 1031 exchange in mind, because that's just the nature of the business. We are selling and we're going to be purchasing. So that works. Then you have 45 days to identify it and you have 180 days to close. But if you're just selling, if somebody wants to sell for a profit, and then somebody says, yeah, but you're going to pay lots of taxes, you may as well just roll it into another deal, it's going to be very hard to make the deadlines in order to do the 1031 exchange.
That's really helpful. So actually, I will give an example of an investor going through this right now. So they had acquired some land, they recently sold it, and they're looking to identify the next investment. The part where we all were kind of wondering is what is the length of closing time for that? And as you mentioned, that is 180 days. So they've identified, the next investment opportunity with me, and thankfully we'll be closing in about 140 days, not 180. So it does work out from a time perspective.
Right.
But yes, the timing is difficult because most of these investments that we are buying, the due diligence time to the time we actually close on the property is about 3 months. So that is, close to 90 days in itself. And we want to make sure, you're finding the right one. Well, that's
Right.
wonderful to hear. You mentioned something, and I just want to dig in deeper a little bit more on it. So you said, hey, you can take the property and then find up to 3 potential properties. What does that mean? So let's say, and let's take an example. And for simplicity, let's say you got $3 million and let's say you're finding 3 properties. Are you saying you can take the $3 million and chunk it up into 3 specific properties? Or go ahead.
So you can identify 3 properties. Each property can be worth $10 million. It can be worth $3 million each, or $10 million. It doesn't make a difference. And then you can put all your $3 million into one property. You can also divide it up if you like and put $1 million into 3 different properties. But the catch is that you can't identify more than 3 properties. So you have to have an idea of which one. You could do all of them. You could do only one of them if that's what you choose.
Got it. Okay. So the identification process in the 45 days, you basically are saying, here's 3 potential properties I may go after. So I've ID'd 3. And then I finally pick one of the 3 and actually close on one of those 3. That is an option.
Right.
Or I pick less of the total amount in 3. So there's combinations that are available to us. So it could be one of those 3, 2 of those 3, all 3 of those 3. Now let's say for that.
It's not that simple. I'll just throw another monkey wrench into this. You need to identify, when we say property, it's not enough to say I'm getting a piece of this and this property. You need to identify how much you'll be acquiring of that property. So you need to say I'll be acquiring, it could be either a dollar value or it can be a percentage. You need to say I'll be acquiring $1 million of each of these 3 properties, or you can't just leave it blank and say from these 3 properties I'll do whatever suits me with my money. It's got to be, that's part of identification.
That absolutely makes sense. Okay. Yeah, so that totally resonates with kind of how we even finish our PPM and documents at the end. Once the property is closed, we actually tell our investors what percentage ownership that they have. So there's reports that we kind of share with them. So that totally makes sense.
Well,
Um,
there is one thing I want to just point out that you can retract your identification until the 45-day deadline, and you could change it. So you can identify 10% of each of the three properties, and if at the end of the day you want to put 30%, you want to buy 30% of one of the three properties, you can just, as long as it's less than 45 days from the closing, you can just change your identification.
Yeah. Yep. Totally makes sense. So, Aziz, great question. And I'll come to that. I think I was going to ask the opposite of it, which was what if you did have a big property you wanted to invest in, but you didn't have enough funds? Can you add funds to that 1031? So let's say you're purchasing a property, you only had 1 million total that you got from the 1031 exchange, but the new property you wanted to buy was 1.5 million. What happens in that scenario?
Absolutely. You can buy a $200 million property and add whatever you want. This is just the question is, what are you doing with this money? So you're exchanging, again, what you're doing is you're taking $1 million and identifying 5% of that property, and that's what you're buying with your exchange money. Now, in a separate avenue, you're also spending money from your pocket and buying the other 95%. So it's not a problem.
That part is fine. Now let's think about the opposite, which is the question that's being asked. So let's say you identify a property and it only like let's say 75% of the value gets used, and now you have 25% of the money left. What do you do in that instance? Do you pay taxes on that 25%?
You do. But unfortunately, you pay the more expensive taxes first. So first you would pay 37% on, if that's what tax bracket you're in, on the bonus depreciation, then 25% on the depreciation, and only whatever is left over would you pay 20% on capital gains.
Understood. Okay. Okay. Well, that was a very good question. Now, you had mentioned, so this has been really helpful so far, kind of thinking about, okay, if you're going to do 1031 exchange, we talked about that. So let's find your intermediary first, identify who you're going to work with. Then at the closing, you have 45 days from there to identify the property or multiple properties. From there, you identify and you purchase them. Now, when we go through all of these processes, you had mentioned initially it needs to be like kind of properties when we are exchanging them. And can we talk a little bit about when we say identifying the property, because that's a whole another level of complexity in itself. So let's talk about when we identify the properties, what characteristics are we looking for to make sure it qualifies?
So all real estate is, just bunched into one category. It doesn't make a difference if it's short-term rentals, if it's multifamily, if it's land. It's quite broad as far as real estate is concerned. There are two aspects to a property that are important. It has to be held either for productive use or for investment purposes. So, for example, if it's for personal use, that doesn't work. Or if you plan on gifting it to someone, that's also, you're not purchasing it for investment or productive use. Those are the classic, that's the classic rule of what means like kind property.
Okay, so let's just dig in that a little bit deeper because I think I understand, but I just want to make sure. So let's say the property I sold was my personal home and I'm actually downgrading into a smaller one. So then I'll have leftover money. What can I do in those instances where I have leftover money and now I'm going to do a 1031 exchange into something else? So I can buy another house, but for personal use. So two homes for personal use.
When you're selling your personal home, there's no 1031 exchange. That's because the real estate that you're selling is not investment or productive use. The 1031 exchange rules do not apply. There are rules for selling a personal home and what the tax exemption are.
Right. So now let's say it's an investment. So I'm going to just clarify through all the scenarios to make sure everybody understands. So when it is an investment property and we are able to kind of purchase it, what type of investment? So I need to put it into an investment only. I cannot put it into a gift.
Right.
So
I
can
mean,
you?
it was a court case where somebody sold a property and then bought a property and gifted it to his children. And that 1031 was invalid because both ends have to be for investment or productive use.
Got it. Okay. So investment to investment. Now, any type of real estate you said. So let's say if I had, there are short-term rentals, there are long-term rentals. Let's say there are commercial properties, where you can buy, office buildings and stuff. Do they all qualify as same?
Yes, you can sell industrial warehouse and buy a short-term rental. You can sell a multifamily and buy office space. It's all considered like kind property.
Understood. Thank you.
The
And
one thing that I should point out is where this rule comes into effect is if you're a developer. So you're buying properties, you're developing property to sell. That's not for investment and it's not for productive use. Dealer property is not eligible for a 1031 exchange because it's considered inventory. It's not called investment.
understood. Understood. Wow. There are quite a few rules. I think this is where just having somebody like you to kind of run things by, I think it's very helpful. So what about, I have quite a few investors who also do they are venture capitalists. They go out and invest in companies. So could you do a 1031 from real estate into, say, a startup?
No. Before the 2018 or 2019, whatever it was, Tax Jobs and Cuts Act, you were able to exchange lots of different kinds of property, like fancy paintings, cars, trucks, whatever it was. But it became only real estate, and no other investment qualifies. It's got to be real property.
Understood. 1031 is only for real estate. We could not do any other investments to investments.
Correct. Today, that's the way it goes.
Got it. Okay. That sounds good. Um, I will pause here to see if there's any questions. I do have a couple more things to ask you, but I will pause here if anybody on the phone has questions. So far, we have had some great questions. Yep, Aziz, go ahead. And thank you for putting your questions in chat. We will kind of continue to take them from there as I see them come through. So we'll just wait for that for one moment. Yes, great, thank you. So while you're putting that question in there, I will ask, Svi, what strategies have you kind of worked with folks on the 1031 exchange? Let's say they wanted to invest in multiple properties, but we talked about like there weren't enough funds, but now let's say there's two 1031 exchanges and I sold them and I want to buy something one bigger. Is there a way to combine those 1031?
Yes, you can do that. The problem with that is that you're not gonna get the benefit of the doubt. The deadlines will always be from the first 1031 exchange.
Got it. Okay.
You're just cutting your timeline a little bit shorter.
Depending on whichever one was first. Okay, but there's a way to combine it to kind of simplify. And
Yes.
for me personally, I kind of think about this too. Like, let's say I've done 1031 for multiple properties, but I still want to pull some of that money out, but I'd be paying taxes with the highest tax bracket first and then, or highest, I think
Right.
you worded it really well. All right, I think the next question is, if you have identified a property, but that property is not available after 45 days deadline has passed, what happens then? You cannot add any new property to 45-day identifier form, so what happens?
So once you've identified property, your money is stuck for 180 days. You can't get your money back after 45 days if you see that the deal is not going to close at the end. That's one of the problems. And while it may not be a problem for you, it's a problem for the exchanger because that means that the exchanger who's holding money is giving money back and they're not really holding it by themselves without any interference from the exchangers. So that can really do in a whole 1031 company because the government will say these guys aren't really QIs. So while for you it's okay to take the money back because you're paying taxes anyway, but the exchanger, the QI, will never let you get the money back. Sometimes they will. There are circumstances where they're allowed to give you the money back, but that's rare.
So you'd end up paying taxes. Yeah,
You'll
so
end up paying taxes and you won't get the money back before the 180-day period expires.
got it. Yep, so that's exactly yeah, that just answered Aziz's follow-up question.
If it's before 45 days and you see it's not going to close, you can revoke your ID. And if 45 days expires and you haven't identified, then the exchange fails anyway and you're welcome to have your money back.
There we go. There we go. That totally makes sense. Thank you for that response. Question from Sridhar. Thank you, Sridhar, for the question. Can we sell multiple properties around the same time and include in one exchange and use it to buy one bigger property? I had just asked that, but yeah, please go ahead, Svi.
Yeah, the smarter way to do that anyway. I mean, the only reason why you would combine it is because, just to give you an idea, an exchange costs anywhere from $1,800 to $2,500. We're not talking about a huge amount of money. in the scope of a real estate deal. So you would want to combine it because you only want to pay for one exchange. But if you did it in two exchange, then each one can buy 5% of the property. You can split it up, two identifications, two exchanges, and they can work together, just like you typically would do in a real estate deal anyway. You're not the only player there. And the whole point of combining exchanges become mute, and you'll have more time, obviously, for the later exchanges, for the later sales.
Absolutely. That hopefully that helps, Sridhar. So that was exactly my question, and it does just come down to timeline. And unless there are quite a few, investment opportunities you're seeing, and you're like, "Yep, I'm pretty confident I can find something and close it together," that's kind of where it makes sense. But if you are nervous about it, maybe just keeping it separate until you can kind of reconvene the timeline at a later point in future when you could sell both of those 1031 again. I think the good news about 1031 personally I like is there's more options and opportunities available throughout the future time where you could combine and do something like that.
Correct.
That's a great question. Well, that was all the questions I had, and I'm just going to give a moment to folks here today to see if there's any other questions. I knew this would be a shorter session today. We had only planned 45 minutes, so I just want to make sure if there's any other questions, please put them in the chat. I'm really happy, Svi, to hear some of the details that you had shared today. 1031 exchanges are, personally, I learned a lot from just talking with you and understanding the complexity behind it and the time it takes. Like you had shared, I think I did also have older knowledge about 1031 exchanges for things beyond just real estate. So that is a news to me. So thanks for sharing that as well. I figured people buy paintings and call it investments, but it just feels like it's a different kind of investment, and maybe they're their own class now. You can't really do 1031s with them anymore.
Right.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining today. Thank you, Svi, for your time. And we will put this recording out for everybody to view. There's quite a few detailed things that we talked about today, and we'll make sure to kind of share that along with you so that you have it for your reference. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Divya.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.